The inevitable day when TBC re-releases on Anniversary Realms is drawing ever closer. The waiting room for this is large and only growing, and in that run up to TBC you'll need to decide which class to play through it on this time around. Whether you're a hybrid waiting for your raid viability, a DPS looking for new ways to play, or just somebody who wants to take advantage of the new race class combos, TBC changes up the meta of vanilla WoW massively, and it does so in a way where many different classes and specs are now of use within your raid. So today I'm going to be covering every single class and spec in TBC and giving you some information on how well they're expected to perform in this expansion. Will raids actively be looking to bring multiple of this class, and ultimately how in demand will they be? There is one thing to mention for TBC as an expansion as a whole though really. In this expansion Blizzard did solve you wanting to bring a ton of different classes and specs to your raid, but they did this through giving many specs a unique buff or debuff, which often made their group just a bit stronger as a result. But when you stack up all these little buffs or debuffs here and there, the overall impact to your raid is significant. So expect many specs to feel as though they're absolutely mandatory in a raid, but beyond one of them, you don't really benefit massively from having a second. And if you do want to get the most out of your class, having an optimal group setup will absolutely make the difference in TBC, which can lead to this expansion's raids often feeling as though they have pretty strict group comp requirements. Then again, this is all a bit more min-maxy and it's not always necessary for most of the content. We'll begin with the clothies today, and first up is the Warlock. Warlock improves massively going from vanilla to TBC, and is promoted from just a class that puts up curses as its main role to one of the best and most consistent damage dealers of the entire expansion. Warlock starts off strong right at the start of TBC and retains that place as a top damage dealer for literally the whole expansion. On top of that, they have a rather infamous playstyle, shall we say, and that's because similar to vanilla, you really just apply your curse and then press Shadow Bolt, and that is it. That's your rotation. In fact, a bunch of casters in TBC kind of still just press one button, so it's not unfamiliar, and going full on Shadow spec will be the spec to play as well, despite Destruction Locks getting more fire-based talents in that tree, and a new fire spell, Incinerate. There are several reasons for this. Early on in TBC, you have to pick a certain damage type with gear upgrades from the likes of Shadow Frost. The meta DPS build has you sacrifice a demon, and you have to pick between fire or shadow. Seed of Corruption, your brand new, incredibly powerful AoE spell, does shadow damage, and improved Shadow Bolt makes future shadow spells do more damage when that spell crits. So all in all, you really do want to be Shadow, because whilst fire is quite competitive on single target, Shadow is way better on AoE, and it's way better when you're stacking Warlocks, which you might be. Chances are you're going to have multiple Dastro Locks in your raid too, and they are one of the few stackable DPS classes in the game during TBC. There is an alternative Warlock spec too, where you play Affliction for Imp's improved Blood Pact for its stamina buff, and the Shadow's Embrace debuff in the Affliction tree that makes enemies do 5% less physical damage. This can be good when you're early in progression for bosses that hit hard, particularly in the Sunwell, but it shouldn't be a spec that's played every single week. Also, this spec does way less damage than traditional Destruction too, and it's more of a support Warlock spec. Overall, you can't really go wrong playing Warlock in TBC. Their single target is among the best in the game, and their AoE is the best by a long way. The main problems can come down to the playstyle, where you're just going to be pressing one button for the entire expansion more or less, but if you're fine with that, then this is pretty ideal. The second problem can be threat. On both single target or AoE, you are a threat generating machine, and you can over aggro tanks pretty easily. You do have Soul Shatter to drop threat, but it's got a long cooldown and can still be resisted in certain circumstances. All that being said, Warlock as a DPS is a great pick for TBC. Before we go on, a quick word from today's sponsor, Boot.dev. Boot.dev teaches back-end web development from start to finish in Python, SQL, and Go. What sets them apart is their focus on teaching fundamentals in depth, ensuring you're truly prepared for the job. The crucial difference here is that you'll be writing loads of your own code, learning by what you'll be doing, and building real projects along the way. Boot keeps things interesting with experience, levels, and achievements, as well as the ability to complete complete quests and fight bosses whilst you're learning. They've also just launched the Training Grounds, a place where you can grind infinite challenges to get as much practice as you need before moving on. And if you do get stuck, there is Boots, an AI assistant trained on every lesson who has full context of what you're learning, though he won't just give you the answers outright, but ask follow-up questions and push you back in the right direction. On top of that, all content is free to read and watch, and there's a free demo of the interactive experience on every course, as well as a 30 days no questions asked refund policy. If it sounds good, why not give it a go? You can click the link in the description and use my code WILLY to get 25% off your entire first year for boot.dev. Many thanks as always to boot.dev for supporting the channel. Let's get on back to WoW. Next up we have the Mage. Coming from vanilla, this was easily the best caster in the game, but now it has way more competition from other classes. Mages in PvE have two main specs to play, those are Fire and Arcane, though which one you'll be playing will depend on how much support you are given as a mage, as well as how far progressed we are into the expansion. So when we were going into TBC Classic originally in 2020, it was expected that you would start as Arcane and then would gradually swap over to Fire as you gained more gear and crit chance. In reality, during TBC Classic, mages were able to play Arcane for the entire expansion and perform well. Arcane as a spec though needs more support than your average class does. This is because they deal damage through spamming Arcane Blast with cooldowns up for as long as possible, and as you cast Arcane Blast, that means its mana cost is increasing up to a cap, so you'll need ways to generate tons of mana back during a fight for you to really do good damage. This means you need to be in a group with a Shadow Priest for Vampiric Touch, you want a Mana Tide totem from a Shaman when that's available, and you need Druids to press Innovate on you when it's called for. If you're able to get all of these things, then Arcane can genuinely be one of the best DPS in the game. Well, it starts fairly strong in tier 4 and then has a huge power spike in tier 5 due to their tier set bonus that buffs Arcane Blast. It does fall off though later into tier 6 and the Sunwell. Fire gradually improves as time goes on and can compete with Arcane by the time we're late into the expansion, but by that time mages have been overtaken on damage by a number of other classes anyway. Because their overall best DPS spec, Arcane, is resource hungry, it makes mages very much impractical to stack, and I doubt you'd really see more than 2 mages per raid most of the time. As for playing Fire, well, it's kind of just not very good until late into the expansion, and its only unique selling point is improved Scorch, and there really aren't any relevant sources of fire damage to buff because Warlocks are probably going to be playing Shadow. All in all, for the Mage, expect to do the most DPS as Arcane with appropriate levels of support. You'll have a massive power spike in tier 5, but you'll fall off again damage-wise later into TBC. Next Clothy we have is the Priest, and for TBC there's a lot more to talk about than them just being good healers. The big winner from the Priest class has to be Shadow. They go from being a bit of a meme in vanilla which always goes zoom, to a spec that ensures their party never go zoom. They bring the Shadow Weaving debuff for 10% more shadow damage, on top of Misery that's a further 5% magic damage to their target. Vampiric Embrace allows them to convert some of their damage to healing too, but their biggest selling point is definitely Vampiric Touch. This new damage over time effect converts 5% of their shadow spell damage into mana for your party. The mana restored through this over the course of a fight will be in the thousands, and it's an invaluable resource gain for the healers, arcane mages, or even the likes of a protection paladin. This makes Shadow Priest a mandatory pick for every raid. However, it is often the case where raids will just pick up one Shadow Priest. You can work with 2 if you have a caster heavy raid in general and they benefit from it, but it does depend on your comp and what you have to work with. So as in demand as Shadow will be, you won't see loads of them. You should also know Shadow Priest really doesn't do that well on the damage meters. Well, I say that, they start doing not so bad right at the beginning of tier 4, but it's all downhill from there. The reason being is that damage over time and channeled effects still don't scale with haste and cannot crit in TBC, and for Shadow Priest that means nearly all of your damage only scales with raw spell power, which means their scaling with gear is absolutely terrible, like the worst in the game levels of bad. So Shadow Priest, amazing supportive spec, very much wanted, but not stacked in TBC. What about Healing Priest then? Well, there's generally two ways to go here as well. First is your classic Holy Priest type build, where you go all the way down the talent tree to get Circle of Healing. This allows you to put out amazing AoE heals on up to 5 players in a group, provided they're pretty close to one another, albeit it is very mana intensive to do so. Holy Priest still has that huge toolkit of healing, where they have an ability for every situation. Similar story to vanilla really, can't go wrong with a Holy Priest, and they will find spots in raids in TBC for sure, usually as a one-of though. The alternative priest spec is going into Discipline, and there are several bonuses here. One of them is going for improved Divine Spirit. This makes Divine Spirit improve a target's spell power by 10% of their total spirit, which can add a decent extra chunk of spell power to both healers or other casters in general, though it does so at the expense of your personal heals. When you play this spec, you also get Power Infusion too, however it's changed in TBC to no longer be 20% bonus damage and instead 20% bonus haste. You also get Pain Suppression at the bottom of the tree, which has some uses on harder hitting bosses. For Priest, really the big news now is that Shadow is not only playable but actively sought after, and Holy and Discipline keep their place as strong healers or supportive specs in all scenarios. Next we have the Druid, and overall Druid has had the most improvements between vanilla and TBC as a class. In vanilla it went from, you know, some of their specs are okay, to now all of them are very much wanted. We'll start with Feral, as we've got both DPS and tanking to talk about here. Feral sees improvements compared to vanilla, where you no longer need to go and farm manual crowd pummelers to min-max your damage, as Blizzard started making Feral weapons which had a ton of attack power on them and were just way better. Leader of the Pack was also buffed from 3% crit to 5%, and on top of that you bring your usual Druid utility like Battle Res, Innovate and Fairy Fire. Feral DPS is still not a top damage dealer though, and your utility is really the same as what a Feral tank can bring. This means that it's often the case in TBC that if you are Feral, you will be tanking to some extent. That is, unless you have a melee heavy raid that would benefit from somebody who's just playing cat DPS. As for Feral tanking, they see huge improvements compared to vanilla, and are now the best overall tank on single target threat. And threat, as I keep going on about, is a massive deal in TBC, so min-maxing as a main tank to generate the most threat is genuinely something that everyone should want to do. Mangle is your big new ability, and this thing, when it crits, just generates a crazy amount of threat. Feral's also super tanky with a massive health pool and a ton of armor baseline, making them a sturdy and consistent tank, and one that can always go cat and do some damage as well. It won't be a ton of damage because you'll be talented and itemizing for tank, but it's a lot better than what Warrior or Paladin could do anyway. Balanced Druid gets some nice buffs as well. Moonkin Aura goes from 3 to 5% spell crit, Insect Swarm is now usable in Moonkin form and reduces a boss's hit chance by 2%, not a huge deal but it's better than nothing on some harder hitting bosses, and you also bring along improved Fairy Fire. This makes Fairy Fire on top of the armor debuff apply a 3% physical hit debuff to the target. You have less mana problems in TBC, but your rotation is really still just press Fairy Fire and Starfire and innovate people when you're asked to. Equally, you don't really do that much damage or scale that well with gear either, so expect Moonkin to be a one-off supportive type spec in your raid, which will find a home in your caster group. There is also a Resto Kim build too, which goes down the balance tree to get improved Fairy Fire, as well as into the Resto tree somewhat to be able to heal. Basically, the idea is that you just press Fairy Fire on everything that moves in a raid, so your physical DPS can itemize for 3% less hit, but then you aren't really playing balance or Resto, you're just a guy that presses Fairy Fire. Finally, you have Resto Druid. They apply bonus heals to members of their party and bring your standard of a good Druid utility. And similar to some other Druid specs we've gone over here, they're a good pickup for a raid comp, albeit it will be a one-off type addition. Overall for Druid, their most improved spec is easily Feral Tank, which goes from decent in vanilla if you put in a lot of effort, to now super in demand for TBC as main tank. Feral DPS gets better and can fit in raids that benefit from a second leader of the pack, but they won't be a top damage dealer. Balance is better as well and is a good part of a caster group, and Restoration often goes in with the tanks for the bonus heals they provide to their party. Now we have the Rogue, a class that wasn't very well treated when we first went to TBC again in 2020, but one that definitely has its upsides. In TBC, Rogue will primarily be playing combat in PvE, with good DPS cooldowns from the likes of Blade Flurry and Adrenaline Rush. This class can excel on 2-target cleave fights because of this. However, they don't start the expansion in a strong place during PvE content at all, having both low damage and survivability problems as well. The Rogue's main tool in raids is improved Expose Armor. This is a finishing move that reduces your target's armor massively and therefore benefits all of your other physical damage dealers. This is the big reason to bring a Rogue to your raid for the majority of TBC, and since you're going to be putting up this debuff which does low damage by itself, it's of course going to impact your individual damage. Rogues however do scale well as the expansion progresses, especially in tier 6 and beyond that point. Of course there are Warglaives which will either go to a Rogue or Warrior, and if you get them you can absolutely be among the top damage dealers, but being in a place where you can expect to receive them and then actually seeing both of them drop is not something you can really ever count on. Raids will typically bring one Rogue for improved Expose Armor, and potentially two as the expansion progresses into later tiers where they begin to improve. Overall it's a class that scales up into TBC, and one that can perform well on fights that demand burst cleave. Now we have the male wearers, starting with the Hunter. Hunter's main role in vanilla was primarily just pulling enemies over to the warriors and providing true shot aura. However, in TBC, just about everything involved with the Hunter changes for the better. First up is now that pets scale with your stats, and they actually do relevant damage. They gain more resist and avoidance too, so they don't just die to any incidental raid damage. Your minimum attack range with ranged weapons is reduced from 7 to 5 yards, so you can always hit with a melee or ranged attack, and your scaling with gear is just way better in general. The big new star for Hunter is Beast Mastery, with key abilities such as Steady Shot and Kill Command. Beast Mastery Hunter begins TBC as a very powerful single target damage dealer and keeps that role for the whole expansion. The Dungeon 4 set has an effect which makes the Hunter ignore 600 of enemies' armor too, and this amount of armor penetration isn't something that other classes can get until way later in TBC. Hunters also get Misdirection too to help pull threat at the start of a fight. The downsides for Hunter is that your magic damage abilities still don't scale with attack power, so in other words they do no damage whatsoever. Your AoE is kind of non-existent because of this, and of course your pets can sometimes still be a bit dumb or people just don't heal them, and having a pet die as a BM Hunter is a bit of a disaster. You may have also heard of the TBC Hunter one button rotation macro that people used back in the day to weave in steady shots between auto attacks, but this just didn't work in TBC Classic, so in reality Hunter in TBC is a class which can have quite a high skill cap. There is also the survival spec for Hunters too. The key benefit of this is the Expose Weakness talent, which applies a debuff on their target that scales with their total agility. This spec does do less damage than Beast Mastery, but it massively benefits your entire raid, so will very much be in demand. So for Hunter you'll want one survival per raid, but you never really need more than that, and Beast Mastery alongside Destruction is one of the most easily stackable classes in the expansion, so Hunter should be in high demand for raids and will be a great overall performer damage wise in TBC. With Shaman available to both factions, everyone gets to enjoy all of this class's benefits now, and they are good at just about everything. TBC is the final expansion where we get to have Wind Fury Totem give bonus attacks for a long time, so your melee better make the most of it. On top of that, Enhancement also bring 10% attack power for their party, as well as their other totem buffs. They are still overall what I call a support spec, but they're probably one of the strongest support specs in TBC, and their damage is consistently pretty good for the entire expansion. An enhancement in a melee group is basically mandatory in TBC due to the amount of extra damage you get from having this spec exist, so your raid will always want one enhance, but it could easily go up to 2 depending on how melee heavy your raid is. Shaman's other DPS spec Elemental also does well. Their unique selling point is mainly Totem of Wrath for their caster group, which will give players both 3% spell crit and hit. In terms of personal performance, they start off fairly strong in tier 4, but similar to Shadow Priest, they really just don't scale well with gear whatsoever. Also, your rotation is kind of just put down your totems and press Lightning Bolt. Elemental will be a spec that you always want one of for your caster group. Beyond that, more than one is possible, but again, it really does just depend on your raid comp. If you have enough casters to justify a second one, yes, otherwise probably no. Last for the Shaman is Restoration. As with all Shaman specs, this one is amazing in TBC, both for their passive totem buffs, especially Mana Tide. Restoration are very consistent healers throughout the entire expansion, with Chain Heal being their main ability, much like things were in vanilla. And of course, all Shamans gain access to Bloodlust or Heroism, which in TBC gives your party 30% haste for 40 seconds. This is still the most powerful cooldown that's ever been made in World of Warcraft to this day. All three Shaman specs are in demand for TBC, so really whichever one is your preferred way to play, getting a raid spot should be no problem. Now we're on to the plate wearers and let's talk Paladin. So Protection Paladin must be overall one of the most improved specs in the game. It goes from not really working as a tank in vanilla to being the best AoE tank in the game in TBC. Their mana problems are helped through the new Spiritual Attunement passive that gives them mana when they're healed. They have a proper taunt now, and they even have a way to pull from range with Avenger's Shield. A Feral and Prot Paladin lineup for tanks is super common in TBC, and every single raid will benefit from having a Prot Paladin in it. This makes Prot Paladin an essential spec for all levels of raiding. Retribution also undergoes big changes. It brings arguably some of the most utility out of any single one spec in the game, with blessings, auras, refreshing judgment effects, and 3% bonus crit on their judgment of the Crusader target. Their damage goes from lackluster in vanilla to competitive in TBC. You're not going to be top damage, but the way you do damage is simply the most fun spec in the game in my opinion, thanks to seal twisting. This is swapping your seal just as you attack, so you proc on hit effects from two different seals at the same time. And thanks to both factions having Seal of Blood now, this is possible. With some good RNG, you can attack up to 6 times in one swing, and there just isn't another spec in the game that feels this good to DPS on. This puts Ret in a place where it's a super valuable one-off pickup for any raid. Holy is also in a place where you would want one of them in your raid too, and if you have one of each Paladin spec, that also covers your free blessings that you need between Salvation, Kings, and Wisdom or Might. Holy is really there for their strong single target heals and blessings. Other than that, they keep the same playstyle as vanilla of just playing whack-a-mole with health bars which fall below full. Paladin is an amazing pick for TBC, whichever spec you want to be. Just know that really it will be one of each of their specs in a raid usually, so the demand will be there, but just up to a certain point. Last but not least, we have the Warrior. Similar to Rogue, they were expected to be subpar for much of TBC, but in reality they turned out to do pretty well. Early on there's a dual-wield arms build that should be popular, as it generates a good amount of rage in low gear, whilst also picking up the Blood Frenzy talent. Blood Frenzy puts up a 4% increased physical damage taken debuff on the target, and arms is the only spec in the game that can do this, which makes one Warrior DPS super important for your average 25 player raid. Fury does consistently do more damage than arms, but lacks this debuff. This puts Fury in a place where it needs to be doing quite a bit more damage for it to feel worth it over arms. And logs prove from TBC that actually Fury was pretty good for the entire expansion, but it definitely needed a lot of gear to do well. Similar to some rogues out there, some lucky warriors will pick up Warglaives and have an amazing time, but it's not something everyone can count on. Fury absolutely outscales arms too, and should be your go-to spec eventually in TBC either way. As for Protection Warrior, it does fall off compared to how good they were in vanilla. They don't do as well threat-wise on single target or AoE. They are still playable of course, and all content has been cleared using this spec, but as mentioned a few times for tanking, threat is just such a big deal this expansion that you really do want to be min-maxing here for the benefit of your entire raid. Overall for Warrior, they perform better than they were expected to during TBC's 2020 release, but definitely aren't on the same level as they were in vanilla. They can be a strong pick, but much like Rogue, I'd ensure I have time to play with a guild and have a consistent raid spot, as the pug life on these types of classes can be tough. And that is roughly how in demand you should expect each class and spec to be in TBC Anniversary, and why they are wanted. Hopefully this helped out if you're newer to TBC, or just just needed a refresher before the expansion drops. Let me know what you're going to be maining this time around and whether there are any other points that were worth a mention for each class in the comments down below. Thanks again to boot.dev for supporting the channel. Their courses are free to view, so if you're interested, why not check them out via the links down below. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you all in the next one very soon.